Very good afternoon to everyone. To Chairperson, Madam Chan Mei-Wah, for that introduction. To the SOCA General Director, Mr. Teng Kiat, Vice General Director, Mr. Michael Yap, thank you for that very generous introduction and also for advertising my book. Thank you. Professor Leo Tan, who is a long-time friend of mine. He was one of the pioneers in NUS when I was there, and I learned a great deal from him, so I'm delighted and honored that he is moderating the Q&A later. To all SOCA members, to distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is such a pleasure and honor to be here this afternoon, and I believe I have about 20 minutes or thereabouts to deliver a lecture, after which I hope that we will have a meaningful dialogue together. Today, it is my great pleasure to talk with you about forging common ground in Singapore and to explore the extent to which, as individuals and as a nation, we can forge such common ground amidst challenges that are brought by the winds of change, both within and beyond our country. To begin, let us do an informal environmental scan. How do you think we're faring as a nation? Where do we stand in terms of national achievements and overall well-being? We're all comfortably seated in this beautiful new auditorium, equipped with state-of-the-art sound and lighting systems. Our iconic HDB housing projects is the envy of many around the world. They not only provide homes for the vast majority of our population, but are also engineering marvels in their own right. The tallest HDB project at Pinnacle at Duxton stands at 52 stories, and it is not alone. Many other projects are built on reclaimed land, safely and soundly. I would say that in some of the countries, if you're thinking of purchasing an apartment that stands on reclaimed land, don't do it. But in Singapore, I think you're really quite safe. Myriad other examples attest to Singapore's remarkable achievements in our economic and social lives. The success narrative has been repeated countless times. Out of a turbulent landscape, rife with challenges of sovereignty, of unemployment, of poverty, squalor, and without a hinterland, this small island nation defied the odds to attain first world status. After almost 58 years post-independence, Singaporeans stand on world-class infrastructure. Flying the flag of cultural and religious diversity, founded on the national ethos of hard work and integrity. We have a reputation like this in many parts of the world. During the COVID pandemic, stories of resilience and courage amongst frontliners and community groups inspired us to rally as one, putting collective interests above personal preferences. Whereas in many other countries, people refuse to wear masks, for example, the vast majority of Singaporeans collaborated and cooperated, even though it's uncomfortable, it's hot, it's difficult to speak and breathe properly. We did what we had to do collectively for the common interests. So Singapore has a great deal to be happy about and to be proud of. Despite the Singapore success story, are there some amongst us who feel that life here is standing room only, both physically and metaphorically? Land scarcity and real estate prices aside, this reality may be especially stark for groups or individuals who are less advantaged, late to the starting line, or simply going through a difficult season in life. As a geographer, my work has delved into how the spaces that we occupy can help us understand the multiple dimensions of competition in Singapore. Space includes physical, virtual, and psychological spaces. The meaning of physical space is obvious, while many of us are now familiar with virtual spaces that are enabled by technology. Psychological space is a more complex concept to define. It explores how individuals' internal thoughts and beliefs may be impacted by their external experiences and perceptions of the world. If the latter are positive, they translate into feelings of psychological security, that our place in the world is assured, that we have the means to navigate our environment and improve our lives. However, if our experiences or encounters generate feelings of discouragement or negativity, we may end up with less favorable judgments of ourselves and others. In turn, these could be expressed as lack of acceptance or even conflict. Whichever notion of space we refer to opens up questions about accessibility and ownership. Which spaces belong to or are deemed exclusive to a group? How should such rights of access of ownership be expressed? Can they be shared amicably? How are inter- and intra-group relations impacted by such rights, perceived or otherwise? Some historical oral accounts cite how, in the days of kampong living, villages marked land ownership by using natural landmarks, such as trees, rocks, or rivers, right? My land ends where that tree begins, or my land goes all the way up to the river. In the old days, this was how we marked what was ours. A stone or a wooden post could be used to indicate territorial boundaries. Planting a specific type of tree, let's just say a coconut tree, or carving a distinct mark onto the tree trunk could also indicate ownership. Sometimes the trees would be passed down from one generation to the next, with ownership and territorial significance well known within the community. These are the days gone by. Kampongs have since disappeared from the Singapore landscape. We are now a much more complex, multifaceted society. Yet, for all who live here, the widely observed local custom of chopping ensures we mark our stake on space. A packet of tissue or an umbrella left at a vacant table in a food court or hawker center indicates this spot is mine, it's taken. And ownership claims respected mostly without question. Although yesterday at the hawker center, I saw someone move the tissue paper. Okay. A bit harder to move a tree, but tissue paper you can kind of move. Now, we might then ask, are all physical space conflicts in Singapore so readily managed or avoided, right? With tissue paper markers and so forth. Or is it much more complex than that? And the answer to that, of course, is this is much more complex than that. Are there subliminal tensions that are less easily negotiated or perhaps not even acknowledged? Such conflicts could include disagreement about the preservation of heritage, whether built heritage or natural heritage. Because on the one hand, we might say, this space, this building has been here for a very long time, and it has the mark of our forefathers and foremothers, our forebears. We shouldn't just demolish them, right? But on the other hand, there are demands of modernity. It could be because you need new housing, you need new roads, new highways. So Singapore has confronted this, particularly between the 1970s and 1990s. These challenges continue today. Should we preserve our old buildings and sites as our national inheritance, or should buildings and spaces from a different era make way for modernity? We may recall how the demolition of the old National Library building and redevelopment of Bukit Brown were subjects of heated contention. Should we clear our secondary forests to make way for housing? Think Dover Forest. Yet another form of conflict takes shape in what we call NIMBYism. NIMBYism, NIMBYISM. The syndrome that takes its acronym from the sentiment, not in my backyard. For example, the government's proposal to build migrant worker dormitories in housing estates caused unhappiness among residents. All of these examples are very real sites of contention that manifest over physical and natural spaces. In Singapore, we have managed to resolve them amicably with dialogue, discussion, and understanding. In other countries, they are the source of intractable conflicts between state or municipal authorities and interest groups and between communal groups. And this extends to religious space as well. So in the book that Michael very kindly introduced to you earlier, I talked about examples all over the world where different religious groups fight over space, where religious groups and the secular state fight over whether a religious building should be there or not. And in Singapore, we have managed to find ways of resolving all of this in amicable ways. And long may that last, because that willingness to give and take, that willingness to understand a different perspective is what allows us to live harmoniously as a society. Differences in perspectives are to be expected. Indeed, some level of difference can be healthy for any society because otherwise it's groupthink. We all think the same way, right? It's sometimes good to have different perspectives. Robust debate can clarify the values that a society stands for. But robust debate that spills over into conflict and even violence suggests that lines have been crossed that might have better been kept intact. Now, let me just turn to virtual space. Singapore's internet penetration rate at the start of this year was 96.9%. 96.9%. That is a really high penetration rate in any context compared to any other place in the world. With such high digital penetration rates, we may actually spend more time online and in virtual spaces than in physical spaces in any one day. If you ask yourself, as you go to the office, you sit at your desk, you're responding to email, you're going to the internet to find out some information, to populate the paper that you're writing, etc., and then you compare it to the amount of time that you walk across the street. Actually, we might be spending more time in virtual space than even physical space. This exponentially raises the potential of virtual space conflicts. In the same way that high penetration rate is a real asset, it allows us to do our work more efficiently, more effectively perhaps, it is also the case that it poses challenges. It does raise the potential of virtual space conflicts. What might some of these be? The widening digital divide between seniors and the younger generation, between those with limited or no access to digital technologies and/or skills, and those who are better endowed. These create the phenomenon of digital left behinds, right? With the Generation Z switching with ease between TikTok, Twitter, Discord, IG, I won't be surprised if some of you ask, what are those things, right? But for young people, it's a matter of course, and they switch from one to the other seamlessly and effortlessly. While the younger generation lives in that world, older adults may still be adapting to things like, how do I pay with PayLah, right? Bewildered by memes or dance challenges that their children or grandchildren take part in. So you see, there can be a divide that occurs because of virtual space. Even within groups that are digitally engaged, there could be tribes deep in echo chambers that reflect and reinforce only their views, shutting down or putting down other opinions. Such digital tribalism, as it's been called, are virtual territorial rocks. Remember I talked about the rocks and the trees marking the territories? Well, today it's digital tribalism and virtual territorial rocks, ring-fencing comfort zones, but at the same time undermining common ground and shaking social foundations. If you're in one particular echo chamber and you're always hearing views of the same kind and you don't hear other views, your mind believes in that view and that view only. And you therefore don't have the opportunity of exchanging views, hearing other options, other alternatives. And that diminishes the common ground in society. Now, let me talk about psychological space. Singapore's open economy renders it vulnerable to the forces of globalization, and in turn, to psychological space conflicts, often compounded by perceptions of scarcity. Migration brings in about a third of Singapore's resident population. 1 in 3 marriages registered here is cross-national and may also be cross-ethnic. 1 in 5 Singapore households depend on a live-in foreign domestic worker. At the same time, about 6 in every 100 Singaporeans reside abroad. These figures highlight the potential for increased social tension. Xenophobia can emerge, and the us versus them mentality can emerge, stemming from perceptions of greater crowding, greater job competition, greater competition for opportunities like education. Our well-used term, kiasuism, epitomizes the psychological pressures many feel in Singapore. Young people use the term FOMO, fear of missing out, to denote something similar. The impetus is to secure more than just standing room in the queue to a better life. Parents strategize in their choice of housing options so their children have a chance to enroll in a preferred primary school. Even the potential relocation of a well-known school can give rise to concern and resistance among stakeholders. There'll be a quiz later as to which school that is. On the other hand, if any strata of society feels like they are the have-nots, that however hard they work or whatever they choose to do, they are unable to secure safe and equitable space, this could escalate into psychological restlessness and animosity, threatening social stability. So I've spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about some of the challenges that confront us, whether it's competition over physical space, echo chambers in the virtual space, the shrinking sense of psychological space and psychological comfort. But let me not go away sounding a doom and gloom story. What can we do? Right? What can we do? As a nation, what can we do to expand common ground, build social cohesion and resilience? Can the proverbial coconut tree or territorial rock, keeping disparate groups apart, be removed? Opportunities must be created for people of different socioeconomic status, of different races and religions, of migrants and local communities, of digital haves and have-nots, and intergenerational groups to thrive together. Attention must also be given to those struggling to find wiggle room for their aspirations. At the governmental level, redistributive and inclusive budget policies have been implemented to mitigate distance caused by income and social inequalities. Instruments like Skills Future and the progressive wage model aim to expand career opportunities and uplift workers in targeted sectors. Forward Singapore, with its 6 pillars of empower, equip, care, build, steward, and unite, strives to refresh the social compact and create a level playing field for all. To revive the kampong spirit and sidestep those territorial markers that I was talking about, there must be opportunities to interact, to play together. The National Integration Council, formed since 2009, facilitates integration of migrants within the local community. Further, policy instruments such as HDB grants are given to couples who choose to purchase flats close to their parents in a bid to foster intergenerational relationships and strengthen familial social support networks. Some paradigm shifts indicate we are heading in the right direction. In 2018, HDB opened an integrated facility that co-locates childcare and elder care services within a shared space. Such physical adaptation creates long-term possibilities for socialization and empathy across different age groups. And increasingly, we will need to do more of this as Singapore society ages. You don't want certain communities to be full of the more senior people without the life and vibrancy that young people bring along with it. And you don't want young people to be living in certain housing estates oblivious to other parts of society, including the older part of our society. Beyond legislation and government policy, which we always look to for solutions, are there other things that we can do? What can social and community groups do to complement and expand the impact of these efforts? Not everything must be left to the government alone to handle. To reduce boundary markers between races and religions, ground-up interfaith initiatives can be encouraged. Cultivating more inclusivist practice of religious and cultural traditions. The racial and religious harmony circles, established within every housing constituency, are examples of such efforts. when a secular school and a madrasa get together and work to bring their students onto the play fields together, that opens doors to hearts and minds. When neighbors organize football nights together, sharing cheers and disappointments as favorite teams bond supporters across age, race, gender, and religion, bridging ties are cultivated. These grassroots efforts are as important as the government policies and the legal instruments in building a bonding for society. We can promote a culture of egalitarianism by opening new pathways for communication and expression, especially for often overlooked groups in society. In April, MINDS, or the Movement for Intellectually Disabled of Singapore, launched a set of books with localized versions of keyword sign, which is a gestures-based communication system for those with speaking difficulties. Other than caregivers and professionals working with the disabled, this provides opportunities for members of the public, for you and me, to better understand and perhaps inhabit, even momentarily, the same spaces as those who do not have our same abilities. So the instruments, such as the local version of keyword sign, are being developed. Are we responding to it by learning some of it? Institutions or common interest associations are also avenues to forge common ground. One such initiative undertaken by student volunteers from SMU is called Project Hope. It supports the homeless population in Singapore through outreach efforts to rough sleepers, providing food, hygiene kits, and clothing, and facilitating access to social services and support networks that are facilitated by government ministries, the Ministry of Social and Family Development, but also by religious groups that seek to reach out and support those who are homeless. More attention must also be devoted to tending virtual spaces. For instance, can we front-load initiatives to help the elderly use technology for daily lifestyle transactions and interactions? How can we help? In an SMU, and some will argue, don't, just leave them alone. Why do you want to force them to use all of this? Right? Now, let me share, in an SMU study by the Center for Research on Successful Aging, or ROSA for short, they do a longitudinal study. That means every month they survey 8,000 people, right? And the base is 12,000. Every month, some subset of the 8,000 will respond to a survey. And they've been doing this for at least 5 years, every month. And it's a great database, and it was really helpful during COVID because we could see from our data how COVID was impacting the well-being or otherwise of people aged 55 and above. I don't like to call them elderly because I then fall in that category. In any case, one of the things that we found was those aged 55 and above who used social media, used their handphone, their mobile phone, their well-being was better than those who didn't, because they could still connect with the outside world when they couldn't leave their apartments. It's not rocket science to work it out, but we didn't really think about it until the data stared us in the face. And it made us realize that actually helping a certain population to learn how to use some of this can impact their well-being positively. So it's not just about creating stress by learning how to use PayLah or something else. It can actually have positive benefits. If we characterize the COVID-19 pandemic as a time of war, Some have said it was the Third World War. How can we extend the benefits of digital connectedness during wartime to peacetime as well? We're sort of in peacetime now. I know there's still COVID in the community, but we've more or less learned how to deal with it. So how can we extend the benefits of digital connectedness that were apparent during COVID into peacetime? Something for us to think about and work at. At the other end of the age spectrum, right? I've been talking about elderly people working with technology. At the other end of this age spectrum, can the spaces carved out by young people in social media be cultivated as platforms for respectful dialogue, solidarity, and support, rather than echo chambers of divisiveness and cancel culture? Right? How can we cultivate these increased virtual encounters with those who are different or similar, so that they bring greater awareness and appreciation of alternative perspectives and other truths? Right? So it's not my view and my view alone that is right. That there are other perspectives, and we should at least be open to listening to other perspectives. So, finding common ground in land-scarce Singapore involves fostering a culture of respect and dialogue. In the past, we focused very much on physical space. When I say land-scarce Singapore, already I am referencing physical space, right? I'm already referencing how there's not enough space, therefore it's crowded, therefore we want our space versus that person's space, my community versus your community, and so forth. But it's not just about physical space, it is as much about virtual and psychological space. If you live next to noisy neighbors, is wielding the Protection from Harassment Act, or POHA, or selling your flat the only option? What forms of mediation can rebuild strained relations? And we've got a mediation expert right here, in Mr. Michael Yap. Right? Have we built the capacity for community mediation, even while we develop and position Singapore as a dispute resolution center in international law? Right? So Singapore is positioning ourselves as a dispute resolution center. When countries and companies have disputes, come to Singapore, our lawyers will help to resolve them. It's great, right? We are performing an important function globally, at least regionally. But more than these sorts of mediations, what about mediations between ourselves? Between neighbors that don't like the smell of curry from the neighbor, or wet clothes dripping onto yours from the floor above? Have we learned how to resolve these conflicts ourselves without calling the police? If someone attacks you in social media, and that is so common these days, if someone attacks you in social media, is POHA, or the Protection from Harassment Act, or mounting a counter-attack the best way to address the situation? Should social media platforms themselves play a more active role in forging constructive dialogue? And you know, many of the platforms say we don't get into this, we just provide the platform. Let you go and solve it yourselves. Which means that very often you do get very vitriolic comments in cyberspace. What is the responsibility of these digital platforms? What should they be? A Singapore that stands on common ground is certainly not one where disparate groups jostle to demarcate their space or take their place in society. Rather, it is a community that sees possibilities in shared spaces, adopting time-honored values of respect and solidarity. So the next time you're lunching at the hawker center, have a look around. Remove your tissue pack and invite that solitary diner who's looking for a space to share the extra seat at your table. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kong, for your inspiring lecture. May I now invite Professor Liu Tan on stage for the moderation of the Q&A session. Professor Tan, please. I am sure that Professor Kong's sharing has sparked some thoughts and burning questions in our audience today. You may post and vote for questions on our pigeonhole with the code SPL2023 at www.pigeonhole.at. You may scan the QR code on the slide to enter this page. Alternatively, you may also raise your hand and our staff will bring a microphone to you. I shall now pass the time over to our lecture moderator, Professor Liu Tan. Professor Tan, please.
Thank you. Professor Lily Kong, I don't know how to say it, but I think everyone here will agree with me. You have given us a very comprehensive picture on some can be a very difficult and sensitive topic. And the three things that you highlighted, and I think the questions will revolve around these. How can we reduce distance and difference between diverse groups in Singapore society? How can we foster integration and inclusivity across various segments of society? And to what extent do government initiatives, grassroots movements, and community-driven efforts play a role in expanding our common ground? Singapore, as Professor Kong has alluded to, is unique. We were not a country. We were forced to become a country, and we had to gel from the early days disparate society into a cohesive one. And this has been a great challenge, but in just 20 minutes, she went through 58 years of our independence to where we are today. And it is still a work in progress because if you drop the efforts, if we stop making the effort to build a community, we can go back and regress to where we were or even worse. So I see that we have a number of questions that have been asked. And I will start with the one that has the largest number of votes. Oops. This is a problem with growing old. You pretend you still can see. You know? In the context of race and religion, would you say there is more, before I start this, I just want to remind everyone that this is the topic, right, that we are going, sharing our common ground, right? Try to stick to this topic. We will allow questions, because time is short, that focus on what Professor Kong has talked about. And the word is common, of common interest, shared interest to everybody in society. And that are the priority for the questions that we will ask. Okay?
Thank you.
In the context of race and religion, would you say that it is more of a tolerance rather than harmony in Singapore? If so, how can we then work together towards achieving harmony?
It's a very good question. And I would say that there is some level of tolerance, and the word tolerance suggests that I don't really like what I see, I don't really see eye to eye with you, but I'll put up with it, right? But actually, over the years, I have done studies of the situation in Singapore, and I actually think that there is a high level of harmony, although there are some issues, right? There's a high level of harmony. So let me just cite an example of how when you say, there are religious groups that have religious processions, or there are religious groups that burn joss sticks in the public during festive seasons, or festivals, not festive seasons, but festivals. Or for some of our Muslim friends, dogs running around might pose a challenge and so forth. People who dress differently because of their religion. When I do the surveys and I ask for responses to how people feel about these things, actually over the years, the level of acceptance has grown. So those are not so much the issue. But the issue is when people feel that because of my race, for example, something is denied me. Like I can't get a job or I can't rent an apartment. Now that's a real denial, and there is a sense in society that some of those kinds of behaviors are still there, right? So whether we like it or not, that sense of racial discrimination, for example, is there. Now, the question is, how do we grow the first bit, where it's not just tolerance but acceptance of other people's practices, right? The examples that I cited earlier were about people's willingness to accept other people's practices. And that level of acceptance of other people's practices, I think, is good and healthy. But then when it comes to impinge more closely, like it's my apartment, I don't want to rent it to such and such a person, or that's coming closer to home and therefore more difficult to address. Now, having said that, I cited figures earlier about cross-national and cross-ethnic marriages. That's actually also on the rise, and that's also coming closer to home, right? Because your family member is marrying someone of a different religion, a different race, and actually more of that is happening. Okay, so there is no simple answer to say, yes, there is harmony, no, there is just tolerance. There's no simple answer to say, yes, it's all moving in one direction, because the behaviors, the beliefs, the values manifest themselves in different ways. And in some instances, it's getting better. In some instances, it's a little bit hairy. In some instances, it'll get worse before it gets better. So it really does make for a very complex situation. And I think that it's not easy to say we are there. And I actually very much agree with our founding Prime Minister that these are things that we have to continually work at. We cannot, for one moment, think that, oh, we're getting better, therefore we have to let our guard down, we can let everything, go, etc. It's a constant work in progress. And sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. Just as a society, not just the government, but as society, we need to constantly work at it.
Thank you. That was a very burning question, but as you can see, it's a work in progress. Another popular question: rather than being resigned to the fate of staying, that means not leaving this heavily populated and competitive space, or leaving the country, what can we as an individual do to thrive in this space?
I think that, I talked about physical space, virtual space, psychological space. It is in physical space that we feel crowded. We're a tiny island state. With reclamation, we're just above 700 square meters, kilometers, sorry. Okay, sometimes it feels like 700 square meters. But we can create psychological space for ourselves. And we create psychological space. I referenced what that means. It means feeling like you're part of a community. It feels like you are, in a good place with other people whom you can bond with, you can bridge with. You feel a sense of security. And even in crowded spaces, you can create that psychological space, and that, and soccer manifests that, right? That you're building a community with shared values, that through your shared values, you can do good for society. You find a space and a place for yourself and a meaning for yourself to make a difference, a positive difference. That's creating positive psychological space. And so rather than saying, well, if I don't like this crowdedness, off I go, being part of communities, whether it's a religious group, a sports association, an arts club, a dance company, it's about building bonds with other people and feeling like you're contributing something. And that makes a lot of difference. So it's true whether you're talking about the workplace or you're talking about a country, right? If your colleagues feel a sense of ownership, a sense of community, that you're working towards a shared purpose, you feel a greater sense of ownership and commitment and greater likelihood to stay. But if we choose not to participate, we sit back and you don't have a community that you're a part of, then clearly it will be very hard to feel a sense of belonging, and that sense of crowdedness will lead you to say, well, let me leave.
Thank you for pointing out that it's a two-way process. You just don't depend on externalities to provide for you, but you yourself have to contribute towards, and as you say, the psychological space is important for us too. Okay, here's another boomerang at you. In recent years, there's been an increasing trend in mental health issues. How can we cope with that as a nation? And what could organizations do more to be more understanding and accepting of these people?
That's a really important question. So I was meeting with some of the other university presidents recently, and we were comparing notes about mental health in the universities. And it is true that over time, the numbers have grown that are seeking counseling support. Now, that's for two possible reasons. One is that people are more willing to step forward, whereas in the past, it's a stigma, let's not let it be known. So it's in part a willingness to step forward, but it is not to trivialize the real possibility that there are actually more such cases. What can we do about that? I think organizations, whether it's the workplace, the school, even religious organizations, we all have a role to play. I'll just share a little bit of what we do at SMU, and it may be helpful, might trigger some ideas for you. So we keep a close eye on the number of counselors that there are. We study the ratios in different institutions in different parts of the world, and we make sure that we have adequate numbers of counselors. More than that, counselors actually only come into the picture when somebody actually needs help already. Can we anticipate that better? So we have put in resources to have what we call the peer helpers. There are two kinds. One is staff who are actually hired, whose job is to be friends with people in the community, right? To get a sense of how things are. And then there are students who are peer helpers as well, who volunteer, and we train them to spot signs of stress and distress. And we try and support that. For staff too, right? We think of students a lot, but what about the staff? So we have a 24/7 service that is an outsourced service because colleagues may not feel so comfortable speaking to a fellow colleague. So we have an external outsourced, what we call the Employee Assistance Program, 24/7. We don't need to know about it at all. Here's the number you can call and seek help, right? I think also COVID has shown us how a lot of people have undergone stress. When you have to work at home, in a crowded space, everybody's fighting for Wi-Fi bandwidth, you can't leave the house, and, it gets a little bit uncomfortable. You've got to share that space with the entire family. Husband was okay as long as he was at work, And then suddenly he's there with you 24/7. Okay, the same refers to a wife, huh? To be gender neutral about it. So we did a whole variety of things, which our colleagues expressed a great deal, and students expressed a lot of appreciation for. We sent care packs, we organized virtual lunches, and my colleagues probably will remember some other things that we did, but those are some examples. And as organizations, I think we have the responsibility to keep thinking of ways to keep our finger on the pulse and also to provide the support. But it's an all-of-society effort. It's not just a government effort. It's not just counselors and social workers, etc. Each and every one of us has a responsibility for the people around us.
Thank you. Yes, there are many studies going on mental health issues, both at the research level and even at the school. Ministry of Education is doing a lot of studies together with Institute of Mental Health and with support from foundations to provide longitudinal studies on mental health of both students in schools and as well in tertiary institutions. And this is ongoing. So rest assured, I think the organizations are doing more. But again, it boils down to, as you say, the family, the relationships, and so forth. Okay, here's another interesting one that is. There are lots of them. Sorry.
No, sorry.
You have a question? No, we will allow for individuals, but let me run through those hot questions that have been put up on Pigeonhole, okay? Sure. Ken? There are lots of challenges in this new normal as people are getting used to living in their own space and less willing to keep up with social connections. What can we do about this?
With the greatest of respect, I'm not sure that the premise is one that I immediately identify with. I have found, on campus at least, that when we first got people back from studying at home, virtual classes, etc., my colleagues told me that our students in the classrooms were actually much more interactive than before. They missed that interaction. They wanted that interaction. But it is true that people have gotten used to working from home to some degree. So we've instituted a policy of work from home for up to 2 days a week, and that balance is important. You would have read in the Straits Times or Sunday Times recently about how that is a part of the job interview, right? The employee going for a job interview wants to know whether they can work from home, otherwise they go to some other company. I actually firmly believe that the face-to-face is very important. I recognize that some time working from home is treasured by some colleagues. So some balance between the two is necessary. I really do think, some of my colleagues and I were just in Malaysia, meeting with an advisory council that we have in Malaysia. We have advisory councils in many different countries, Malaysia being one. And the quality and level of discussion and ideas that were generated was so much better in person than over the last 3 years when we met virtually or even in hybrid fashion. There's something about being in the room together that generates bonds, develops ideas in the way that a little box on a screen does not do justice to. So balance. In so many things in life, it's always about balance.
There's so many questions here, but the ones that are most popular are the ones I'm reading out. There are lots of demographic changes over the years in Singapore. How to have the inclusivity and create harmony with the immigrants, with their diverse cultures?
It's a good question and one that we must stare in the face, because when we have people coming with different cultures, it means they have different practices from what we're used to. And we're used to our practices, and we'll say, well, why can't they be more like us? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if practices and belief systems are too diverse, we can't see eye to eye. We disagree on many things. And that can be a source of conflict. On the other hand, diversity is actually a good thing, where we have always been used to one particular way of thinking about something. We've always been used to one particular way of doing something. Having a different perspective actually sometimes enriches. So I use the parallel of the classroom. I understand very much that parents, Singaporeans will want their children to have a place at university. And I completely understand that. But we must always keep some space for international students, right? So if we can take in 3,000 students, do we fill all 3,000 with Singaporean students, or do we say, let's do 2,800 Singaporeans and 200 international students? And I know it's a really difficult one, because if your child is 2,801, and you think, why can't you just let my child in? Why must you go and let the international student in, right? But actually, when you do have diversity in the classroom, it enriches the learning a lot. They hear perspectives from another situation. So you can be studying economics, macroeconomic conditions, right? Or you can be studying sociology or computing. And then you realize that, oh, we've taken for granted our situation the entire time, and we don't understand what it is to be like somewhere else. So actually, a lot of learning takes place peer-to-peer. When they're working in groups together, and the perspectives that are brought to bear from just a different context enables the students to learn better. So I know the answer is to take in 3,200 students. 3,000 Singaporeans and 200 non-Singaporeans. But you see, the challenge will always remain. You increase the intake, people will say, why don't you take the 200, the additional 200 and the additional and the additional? Actually, for Singapore, we're such a small place, we need to make friends beyond Singapore. In the old days, when Singapore and Malaysia were one, the number of times I have heard that generation say, we went to University of Malaya together. And years later, when either I'm a minister and you're the PERMSEC in one country and the other, or we are business people across, picking up the phone and being able to talk to someone and say, let's resolve this issue together, as opposed to writing letters or email, etc., that building the bonds is developing social capital for Singapore. So looking at it from a bigger macro perspective, for the long run, actually it is a positive thing.
Okay, thank you. I'll pick one more from the web, and then I'll open a question, one or two questions to the floor. We're running out of time. Do you have any suggestions on how we can find common grounds through, is that the one? No. How can we foster a more positive mindset when it comes to racial, religious harmony, especially in this era where we see more negative experiences than positive experiences on social media?
So you could say my answer belies my profession, but I firmly believe in education. Not just formal education in schools and universities, but public education. It is so important for us to have the avenues for educating the public about other peoples, other cultures, other religions, other races, and so forth. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to work with one of the ministries to develop an exhibition. And I think it's still there in the Ministry of National Development building. And it was on diversity, harmony in diversity. That was the title of the exhibition. And it had different religious groups, the different practices, but the commonalities. When I was working on it, I realized actually there's so much by way of commonalities. And if only people could see some of that. So the opportunity for public education, learning journeys, And religious organizations can organize them. Arts organizations can do that. Sports organizations coming together to visit an exhibition, to read something together, to watch a movie or a documentary together that opens our eyes to unity in diversity, if I might be a bit cliched about it, right? But there is so much that is actually common where we assume difference.
Thank you. Are there any burning questions from Georgia? We are running behind time because her lecture was so interesting.
That means I ran over time. Sorry.
That's okay. Nobody's complaining, right? Yes, please. Identify yourself, please, if you wish.
Hi, my name is...
I represent the IRO. Right, I think there's one element that is a common thread amongst them. I love your lecture very much. I must say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Certainly I'm going to buy the book.
Thank you, Michael.
One element that is missing in the whole series of presentation was the element of commercial imperative that has driven to the state we are today. What are we talking about? We are talking about when I was a kid, I could go to any field and play football. I could find many places there are a lot of gatherings, people playing football. Today, I find kids looking over the fences, unable to get into the field until they pay a fee. Now the other scenario is, let's look at the dogs. Those days we can walk into anybody's place we want to, not into their homes only, because the doors are all open. And you just can get into the premises, the areas where they live, because then came about the HDB, even then we lived. But what's happening here? Did you see the mushrooming of private estates here, like condominiums? There are plenty. And what it means is that exactly that. Where is the common ground? The common ground, everybody is carving themselves a space and not allowing others. And it's happening not only at individual state, it is now happening at a group state where every condo is saying that. And if you ever try to get into a condo and try to talk to the security, by the time the amount of details it takes over, you want to take back a car and just go back. So that's what's happening. I had a session, a social session, where I had a minister, and the question was raised, how do we ever get back this kampung spirit into this space? I was very, without batting an eyelid, I quickly said that, impossible. I said, we all go back the same way. We lived from the kampung. And what was it in the kampung was that, let's look at very simple things. I know the provision man. He knows exactly what is the things that I need in the house. I can get things, I touch base with people at everything, including banks. Now let's look at the pictures today. We don't have the tellers to touch base anymore.
So do you have a solution?
Yes, actually.
Please. I think we're running out of time. Thank you.
Massaging all this, and that is why we are in the state right now. What do you think about that?
I think you're right in that, society and community has evolved to such an extent that we may not be able to dial back in exactly the same way. But I'd like to share an example of Grab Food. Was it Grab Food? Yeah, it was. So another commercial break. I've got a book on hawker centers coming out. But a chapter in there talks about new business models. In the old days, you go to your hawker, hawker knows exactly what you want. Yeah, a little bit of chili, lots of bean sprouts, etc. Just by looking at you, you don't have to say it, and there is a bond. If you're ordering online, that bond is lost. So is it the fault of technology? Maybe. But are there things we can do? So as part of my research for that particular chapter, I interviewed Grab. And I said, how are you going to address something like this? Are you not, in a sense, destroying community bonds, right? if uncle comes to you every day to buy something from you and suddenly doesn't turn up for 3 days, you notice and you kind of think, is uncle ill? But if you're ordering online and you don't know who the person is ordering online, that is lost. And Grab said to me, we're going to try and replicate that. I'm like, really? How? And they said that they wanted to create a system where, if somebody is ordering the same thing often, you recognize a pattern, or maybe not often, but they wanted an algorithm to do that work. Now, immediately, I can see that people will say, what, an algorithm replacing the human, right? So these are real challenges, you're right. I don't think we're likely to go back to the kampong days, but are there other ways of using technology that can help to create some human connection? I completely agree with you. I think there are a few answers to that. One, technology can be improved to personalize things. Two, technology must not completely replace human interaction. And that for some things, it's still important for the human person to be there. Human interactions must not be completely replaced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Lily Kong has given us a marvelous discourse. A social scientist with a heart in research, understanding the needs of the common person too. And I think this is important, and this is why I thank SOCA for inviting such an eminent person who has a heart, a soul, and a mind, all combined, to help us think about our own future. So Lily, thank you so much on behalf of all of us for a wonderful lecture and your brilliant answers.